In the sanctity of life. And I think that's why I felt, along with so many other Americans, joy, unfortunately, because it feels like...
Seriously?
I mean...
Joy in a man's execution?
Hello, beautiful creatures of the world, and welcome back to Coffee with Kerri-Lynn. It is a rainy day here in the far north of Maine. Up along the Canadian border, it's almost 40 degrees, and all this beautiful, white, glittery, powdery snowshoe dust is turning into a big, slushy lump of yuck in the crown of Maine. I hope everybody is having a beautiful day wherever you might be. I hope you're having a day filled with fabulosity and dang good coffee, because you're gonna need it. Today we're talking about activism journalism and how it is infecting and corrupting the minds of our youth. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the kids are not all right. When I grew up, journalism was completely different than what it is now. I'm a Gen Xer. I'm 53 years old. It's no big secret how old I am on my channel. I tell you all the time. When I was a kid, we grew up with the likes of Walter Cronkite, Dan Rather, Peter Jennings, Diane Sawyer, Barbara Wawa, and they delivered the news in a very professional way. They delivered their facts. I get it. I know the talking points. I'm not oblivious. They delivered the facts in such a way that you could not determine how they felt about the stories that they were covering. Then sometime in the 80s, things started changing with the likes of TV shows like 60 Minutes, where a person who had some scandal or news situation surrounding them came into the studios, was interviewed by Barbara Wawa, and at the end of the interview, Barbara Wawa injected her kind of opinion about how she felt about that interview. Then we had the likes of Rush Limbaugh. Yes, I'm a Rush baby. I listened to Rush with my grandparents in the 80s, and that was the first time that politics was married with one person's opinion. And it was very impactful the way Rush delivered things. And now here, fast forward 35, 40 years later, and we have activism journalism, which is basically somebody's opinion about the news that they are covering, and only an opinion about the news that they are covering, and they marry it with some kind of social activism or political activism. And this is really twisting and warping the minds of our children. As we know, last week, the CEO from United Health Care was assassinated, Brian Thompson. Nobody really knows why Mr. Thompson was assassinated. We just know that a young man walked up to him on the streets of New York and possibly, allegedly, used a 3D printed ghost gun and gunned down this CEO. Now, some of his friends have come out and said that the possible motive behind this young man's actions was that he had a family member who was sick, and the insurance company would not pay for treatment. Other friends of his have come out and said that he had back surgery. And after the back surgery and the taking of pain medications, he was never really the same. We don't know. It's yet to come out. We do know that this young man screamed something as he was being taken from the police car into the jail in Pennsylvania as he is fighting his extradition. He shouted something into the crowd because he knew not only were news channels going to be there, but alternative media was going to be there. Activist journalists were going to be there, and they were going to get his message out to the world via these platforms that we use, the YouTubes, the X, Blue Sky, because that's where a lot of these activist journalists have gone to. They've kept a moderate presence on X since Elon Musk bought it and gave everybody a kind of an even playing field, where he would not silence people with more conservative and less crazy values. And so all the activist journalists ran on over to Blue Sky, where they can do all that crazy, uber liberal, hateful, spiteful, unsympathetic, unempathetic ranting and raging. Now, we saw early last week, after Mr. Thompson was murdered on the streets of New York, we saw Piers Morgan have a panel on his show, and one of the panelists was Taylor Lorenz, and she's an activist journalist, ladies and gentlemen, beautiful creatures of the world, and she was reveling in happiness and joy on Piers Morgan's show about the assassination of the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson. She is bringing the platform of healthcare reform to this assassination. This is what these activist journalists do. Now, I follow Taylor Lorenz, her career a little bit. It's not a big career, ladies and gentlemen, beautiful creatures of the world. She is a privileged person. And that's where most of these activist journalists are coming from. Her parents have some financial privilege in the world, and I'm sure she bossed the hired help around. And she was hired at some media outlets, some newspapers in New York, that hired these trust fund babies, these activist journalists, to kind of come in and write these wild and crazy pieces, as long as they don't get too wild and crazy, because I think that's what got Taylor Lorenz out of a job at one of these newspapers. Just enough to capture the minds and the energy of our youth. These big media outlets use these activist journalists to try to connect with Gen Z, Gen Alpha, and try to motivate the next generation to do reforms in such a way that these activist journalists literally send the youth onto the street to protest, whatever it may be. And they sit in their little ivory towers. They write their opinions. And we all know, Psychology 101, when you are told a thing over and over and over again, that thing becomes your reality. These activist journalists build an echo chamber. They build a following. They build a cult. And they send the youth onto the streets for whatever political motivation that they are screaming about at the time. And they put our children onto the streets in the protests to get hurt, maimed, arrested, while these activist journalists sit in their ivory tower directing traffic, much like they directed the hired help in their homes. Now, Taylor Lorenz fancies herself a journalist. I fancy her a journalist. In her entire career that I have watched, she hasn't had a big career. She's a very young person. I have watched her do some very unethical reporting, some extremely unethical journalism. She has repeatedly and consistently attacked people in alternative media with a conservative voice. She's part of cancel culture, ladies and gentlemen. And she has repeatedly attacked alternative media conservative journalists to a point where she has become known as a professional doxer. She had a podcast recently on Vox Media. The other day, Vox Media said, hey, but let her go. I'm not sure exactly why, But Vox has come out and said it is not because of, her opinion about the CEO, her joy, her revelation about his murder. But it was time they separate. Something maybe about a contract ending. I don't know. They don't want to renew it. But Vox Media wants to distance themselves from Taylor Lorenz, the journalist. Whether you have a small podcast that reaches hundreds of people or a large podcast that reaches millions of people, you need to be responsible for the ideas that you put out in the world. You need to be mindful of the actions that your influence is taking on the world. These activist journalists such as Taylor Lorenz, they're building protesters for their own agenda. They don't care about your children. They don't care how your children feel. The way Taylor Lorenz has been acting all over social media about the murder of Brian Thompson, not only is it despicable, not only is it inhumane, but it's part of a moving agenda. This is catching fire, ladies and gentlemen. Just this morning, workers at McDonald's hope the same thing happened to their CEO. There are activists throughout the country for Big Pharma that feel that the same thing should happen to the CEO of Bayer. There are the big ag protesters and activists that feel the same thing should happen to the CEO of Monsanto. Where does this madness end? It ends when we start rejecting activism journalism. It ends when we start teaching our children to be more sympathetic and more empathetic, more caring and more kind, so that when they hear these activist journalists put their hatred out into the world, they say no thank you. And they cancel culture with kindness. Ladies and gentlemen, beautiful creatures of the world, be the kindness that you want to see in the world. Do not be Taylor Lorenz. And Carpe Diem, because no one promised you a tomorrow.